I thought I had it all, a loving wife, a beautiful family, and a life built on trust. But one discovery unraveled everything, forcing me to face betrayal, lies, and the dark lengths my brother would go to protect me. This is the story of how everything fell apart, and what came next. John Griffin's family history was a tapestry woven with both unwavering loyalty and immense struggle. His father, a disciplined war veteran, instilled in his children the core values of resilience and unity, shaping their early lives. However, the family's stability was profoundly shaken when their mother passed away unexpectedly, leaving John, only 10 years old, grappling with a void that forever altered their family dynamic. For his older brother Carl, this loss led him to seek solace in the streets, navigating a world of rebellion and danger. John, on the other hand, channeled his grief into academics, becoming the stabilizing force their household desperately needed. This dichotomy of personalities, Carl's bold, risk-taking nature and John's steady, grounded approach, often led to clashes. Yet, in an odd way, their differences complemented each other, creating an unspoken balance between the brothers. In high school, John experienced his first taste of love with a girl named Elena. She was everything he admired, vibrant, intelligent, and passionate about literature, a passion they both shared. Their connection was profound, sparking a bond that seemed unbreakable. But life had other plans. Elena's family moved to Europe, leaving John heartbroken and with an early understanding of the sting of loss. That experience shaped how he approached relationships in the future, making him cautious and instilling in him a deep respect for commitment and trust. Years later, when John met Linda, those values became the foundation of their relationship. Before they married, John spent a brief but impactful time mentoring troubled youth through a community outreach program. Among the kids he worked with, one boy, Marcus, stood out. Marcus was brilliant but often found himself drawn into trouble. John's mentorship played a pivotal role in helping Marcus secure a scholarship and turn his life around. Though their paths diverged and they lost touch, John often looked back on those days as some of the most fulfilling in his life. Unbeknownst to him, Marcus would reappear years later with news that would throw John's world into turmoil. During the early years of Linda's career, she and John faced their share of hardships. A poorly timed investment wiped out their savings, forcing John to take on multiple jobs while Linda pursued her MBA. It was a challenging time, but it also strengthened their bond as a couple, teaching them the power of endurance and teamwork. Looking back, John often reflected on those lean years as a testament to their partnership, unaware of the subtle fractures forming beneath the surface. One summer, John and Carl decided to embark on a road trip to reconnect. They visited their childhood home, reliving memories of their late mother and sharing stories beneath the stars. During one particularly candid evening, Carl opened up about a dark chapter in his life that John had never known about, a near-death experience during his time with a gang. That vulnerable moment created a turning point in their relationship, bringing them closer than ever before. John, ever the steady force, urged Carl to let go of the guilt he carried and focus on building a better future. Carl's decision to turn his life around was not an easy one. But after that heartfelt road trip with John, something shifted. John's impassioned plea for him to leave his criminal activities behind struck a chord. Carl eventually distanced himself from his dangerous past, choosing a quieter, more stable life. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but step by step, Carl rebuilt himself into a man he could be proud of. 3 years before Linda's business trips began to grow more frequent, John attended a neighborhood barbecue where he met Richard, a man who worked in corporate security. They struck up an easy friendship, and John found himself fascinated by Richard's stories of uncovering fraud and misconduct within corporations. At the time, it seemed like little more than an interesting connection, but as fate would have it, Richard would later play an unexpected role when John's suspicions about Linda began to take shape, unraveling a truth he never thought he'd have to face. That evening, John sat alone in their dimly lit living room. The television hummed softly in the background, casting faint shadows across the walls, but he wasn't watching. His thoughts were elsewhere. Earlier that day, Linda had flown to Florida for another one of her business trips. Normally, John wouldn't have given it a second thought. Trust had always been the cornerstone of their relationship, and jealousy wasn't in his nature. But tonight, an unshakable unease gnawed at him, its grip tightening with every passing moment. The sudden chime of his phone jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. He glanced at the screen. "Carl." "Hey, Carl," John said, attempting to sound casual. "What's going on?" Carl's voice came through calm but firm, with a seriousness that immediately put John on edge. "Not much," he replied, pausing before adding, "but we need to talk." John's brow furrowed, his instincts kicking in. "What about?" he asked, already sensing that this wasn't just a casual check-in. Carl Griffin, once a name that struck fear into the hearts of anyone who crossed him, had a violent past that still lingered in whispers on the streets. Ruthless and efficient, he had ruled his world with an iron grip. But to John, Carl was just his older brother, a fiercely loyal protector who had left that dark life behind at John's urging, trading it for a quieter existence. Even so, there was a weight in Carl's tone now that John hadn't heard in years, and it made his stomach tighten. "I've been keeping tabs on Linda," Carl said after a pause, his words careful but resolute. John stiffened, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though a knot was already forming in his chest. "She's in Florida, right?" Carl continued, his voice low but firm. John nodded, even though Carl couldn't see him. "Yeah. For work." "Why?" Carl took a deep breath before delivering the blow. "I saw something today that doesn't sit right. You need to know." "What are you talking about?" John asked, his voice shaking now. The unease that had been simmering all night surged into something sharper, fear. "I got a video," Carl said, his words cold as steel. "Linda's not in Florida for work. She's with someone else." The words hit John like a punch to the gut. "No," he whispered, shaking his head as if that could dispel the weight of Carl's revelation. "No, that's not possible." "It's real, John," Carl said firmly, his tone unflinching. "I'm sending you the footage." Moments later, John's phone buzzed. His hands trembled as he opened the message, his breath catching in his throat. The video played silently, but its contents screamed louder than anything he'd ever experienced. There she was, Linda, walking through a hotel lobby, hand in hand with another man. The next clip showed them in a car, her hand tangled in his hair, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. This can't be real," John murmured, his voice barely audible as the weight of betrayal settled over him like a heavy fog. His vision blurred, his mind scrambling to find any explanation other than the obvious. "It's real," Carl said again, his voice sharp and final. "I'm sorry, but you needed to know." John sat frozen, staring at the screen in disbelief. The woman he had trusted, loved, and built a life with had betrayed him in a way he never thought possible. The unease he'd felt earlier was now a full-blown storm, and the walls of his once stable world were beginning to crumble. "I wasn't going to let you stay in the dark," Carl said firmly. John's grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles widening as anger bubbled to the surface. "If you knew, why didn't you tell me sooner?" His voice was low but trembled with restrained fury. "I wanted to be certain," Carl replied evenly, his calm tone in stark contrast to John's rising emotion. "You don't just go throwing accusations around without proof. And if I was wrong? You'd be living with that doubt forever, and she'd keep walking all over you." John clenched his jaw, but before he could retort, Carl continued bluntly. "Look, I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, but ignoring it won't fix anything. Do this the smart way, or don't do it at all." For a moment, John was silent, staring at the damning photos on his phone, his mind racing. Every fiber of his being wanted to act, to confront Linda, to call her out, to find the man and make him pay. But Carl's words lingered, cutting through his rage. "Fine," John said finally, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. "I'll hire the PI. But Carl," he hesitated, his voice dropping. "If I ever get my hands on this guy." "Stop." Carl's sharp interruption was like a slap. "Don't go down that road. Trust me, I've seen what revenge does to a man, and it's not worth it. Focus on the truth, John. That's all that matters right now." John exhaled shakily, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. 2 more days, he muttered to himself. "Just 2 more days, and I'll know everything." Later that night, John was sitting alone in the quiet of the living room when his phone rang again. It was Linda. "Hey, babe," she said, her voice warm and cheerful. "Just checking in. How's everything at home?" "Fine," John replied, forcing himself to sound normal. "How's the trip going?" "Busy as usual," Linda answered lightly. "Just 2 more days, and I'll be home." 2 more days, John echoed, keeping his tone steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "You okay?" Linda asked, her voice softening. "You sound off." "I'm fine," John lied, swallowing the knot in his throat. "Just tired." "Well, I'll make it up to you when I'm back," she said playfully. "I promise." "Looking forward to it," John replied, his voice strained. As he hung up, John set the phone down on the table, his hands trembling. The warmth in Linda's voice was almost too much to bear. It clashed violently with the betrayal he now knew existed. The silence in the room was deafening, and for the first time, John felt truly trapped, caught between the life they had built together and the painful reality he could no longer ignore. A few days later, John sat across from Frank, the private investigator Carl had recommended. "My wife has been traveling a lot for work," John began, his voice heavy with apprehension. "A few days ago, my brother told me he saw her with another man, kissing him. He sent me photos and videos, but I need to know the truth. All of it. I can't live like this, not knowing." Frank nodded, jotting notes on a small pad. "Got it. We'll run surveillance and gather everything we can. I've handled cases like this before. You'll get your answers." "How long will it take?" John asked, his voice tight. "Depends," Frank said, shrugging slightly. "Could be a few days, maybe longer. But I'll make it my priority." A week later, John's phone buzzed. His heart pounded as he saw Frank's name on the screen. "What do you have for me?" John asked, his voice tense. "We need to meet," Frank replied. "I have the report ready. It's important." "Is it bad?" John pressed, dread pooling in his chest. Frank paused before responding. "You'll want to see it for yourself." Sitting in Frank's office, John's hands trembled as he opened the folder. Inside were photos that left no room for doubt. Linda wasn't just seeing one man, there were 2. Timothy Brown, her boss, and Alex Williams, the CEO of her company. The images told a story of undeniable intimacy, stolen kisses in hotel lobbies, hands intertwined over dinner, and even moments where the 3 of them were together. Frank broke the silence. "She's not just cheating, John. She's involved with both of them, sometimes separately, sometimes together. This has been going on for at least 2 years." John's breath hitched as he flipped through the damning evidence. His chest felt tight, like he couldn't draw a full breath. The betrayal was worse than he could have imagined, and the weight of it threatened to crush him. Frank leaned forward, his tone serious. "Whatever you decide to do next, think it through. Don't act on anger alone. You've got to stay clear-headed." John nodded numbly, his mind spinning. The life he thought he knew was gone, shattered beyond recognition. Now, he was left with the impossible task of deciding what came next. "I don't even know where to start," John admitted, his voice trembling as he sat across from Frank. "What do I say? How do I face her?" "That's up to you," Frank replied, his tone steady but firm. But now, you have the power. You know the truth, and you can decide what comes next. John rose from the chair, clutching the folder tightly as though it were a lifeline. "Thanks, Frank," he muttered, though his words sounded hollow, the weight of the truth crushing him. They say the truth sets you free, but for John, it only trapped him in a new kind of prison, one built from betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak. He had always believed his life with Linda was rooted in love and partnership. Together, they had raised 2 boys, celebrated milestones, and endured challenges as a team, or so he thought. But this wasn't just infidelity, it was outright mockery. The messages he had uncovered tore through him like shards of glass. Among them, Linda had admitted to Timothy that she used John for appearances and financial security while maintaining a double life. Then came the final blow. As he scrolled through more texts, he found a chilling one Linda had sent to Timothy: "If John ever finds out, we'll handle it. He's too soft to do anything about it." John's chest tightened as he reread those words, his heart pounding with a mixture of pain and rage. This wasn't just a betrayal of their vows, it was a calculated destruction of everything he thought they'd built. How had he been so blind? How had he missed the signs? His love for Linda had shielded him from the truth for so long, but now, the veil was lifted, and the reality of who she truly was crushed him. One thing was clear: he couldn't stay in this marriage, not after everything he had seen and heard. If Linda was willing to weaponize their family and destroy him for her own selfish gain, then John knew what he had to do. He wouldn't just leave quietly. He wouldn't let her win. He would fight, not just for himself but for his boys. Grabbing his phone with trembling hands, he dialed Carl. Later that evening, Linda returned home, radiating confidence as she walked through the door. She was talking animatedly about her day, recounting how she had closed a major deal for her company. "We nailed it today," she said with a grin. "The whole team's thrilled. It's a huge win." John sat at the dinner table, his gaze fixed on her as she poured herself a glass of water and continued to talk, completely oblivious to the storm brewing within him. Setting his fork down, he forced himself to keep his tone casual. "Sounds like you had an amazing day." "It was incredible," Linda replied, grinning as she took a seat across from him. "I'm on cloud 9 right now. How about you? How was your day?" For a moment, John hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of what he knew threatening to crush him. But he wasn't ready to lay all his cards on the table. Not yet. Let her feel the pressure first, he thought. "Oh, my day was enlightening," he said, his tone calm but carrying a sharp undercurrent. Linda's smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked with a laugh, brushing it off. "You're being so cryptic." John leaned forward, his voice steady but cutting. "You're right. It's not funny," he said, his eyes boring into hers. "And I think you'll find it even less amusing when I have everything I need to prove what you've been up to." The color drained from Linda's face, her confident demeanor cracking as her eyes darted away. For a fleeting moment, she looked panicked, but she quickly forced herself to meet his gaze again. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, her voice wavering just enough to betray her unease. John tilted his head, studying her carefully. "Don't you?" he asked, his tone laced with quiet fury. "Because I think you do." Linda opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. John could see the gears turning in her head as she scrambled to regain control of the situation. This is it, John thought. The moment of reckoning. But he wasn't ready to confront her fully, not yet. He wanted her to squirm, to feel the weight of his knowledge pressing down on her. For now, he simply picked up his glass of water, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. "Enjoy your dinner," he said coolly, rising from the table. "We'll talk soon." As he left the room, he felt the tension in the air grow thicker with each step. He didn't need to see Linda's face to know she was unraveling. This was only the beginning. I don't know what you're talking about, Linda stammered, her voice trembling as she tried to regain her composure. You're acting crazy. John shook his head slowly, his tone light but threaded with menace. Don't worry, Linda. You'll understand soon enough. She opened her mouth to protest further, but John was already walking away, his calm demeanor only adding to the mounting fear in her eyes. That afternoon, John and Carl sat across from a highly recommended divorce lawyer, a man renowned for his relentless pursuit of justice. The office was pristine, yet it felt heavy with the gravity of what was about to unfold. The lawyer leaned back in his chair, listening intently as Carl explained their strategy. John has already transferred his assets, his savings, the house, investments, everything is under my name now, as part of a business venture. It's all protected. The lawyer smirked slightly, clearly impressed. Unconventional, but effective, he said, nodding. If the judge isn't biased, this could make a significant impact. It's a bold move, but it puts you in a strong position. John leaned forward, his voice steady but laced with resolve. I want her served immediately. Papers, restraining order, everything. I'm done playing her games. The lawyer nodded, already scribbling notes. We'll handle it. The restraining order and divorce papers will be filed together, and she'll be served within the next few days. As for her workplace connections, I'll draft an alienation of affection lawsuit against the company. It'll send a clear message. John sat back, a grim determination settling over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of control, however fragile. A few days later, Linda sat in her office, basking in the glow of another successful deal. She barely noticed when the receptionist entered, holding an envelope. For you, the woman said hesitantly, placing it on Linda's desk before quickly retreating. Linda frowned, picking up the envelope and tearing it open. Her stomach twisted as she scanned the documents inside. A restraining order. Divorce papers. A $2 million alienation of affection lawsuit. Her hands trembled as she read the details, her mind racing. This couldn't be happening. John couldn't be doing this. Just then, there was a commotion outside her office. The CEO, Alex Williams, walked in, followed by the head of HR. Alex's face was pale, his usual confidence replaced with shock. Linda, the HR head began, her tone cold, effective immediately, your employment with this company is terminated. Legal will handle your severance and benefits. What? Linda gasped, her voice cracking. You can't do this. I've given years to this company. Alex turned to the HR head, his expression desperate. This can't be right. What about everything we've built here? It's already done, the HR head replied firmly. Linda's heart pounded as she looked between Alex and the HR head. Everything was unraveling too quickly, her affair, her manipulations, her career. Everything she had worked so hard to hide was now exposed, and the life she had so carefully constructed was collapsing before her eyes. As Alex tried to protest further, Linda sank into her chair, the weight of it all pressing down on her. John wasn't just walking away, he was fighting back. Back at home, John sat with Carl in the quiet living room. The papers had been served, and the wheels were now in motion. You did good, Carl said, clapping his brother on the shoulder. She's going to face the consequences for everything she's done. John nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. But his focus wasn't on Linda anymore. His thoughts were on his boys, keeping them safe and ensuring their future. I'm ready for whatever comes next, John said firmly. Carl smiled, a rare look of pride in his eyes. And whatever it is, you're not doing it alone. By the time Linda reached her car, her phone buzzed again, lighting up with another call. She hesitated before answering, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. It was Timothy Brown, her former boss. Linda, Timothy's voice was frantic. I've been served, divorce papers, restraining orders, everything. My wife has the texts, the videos, the works. We're both screwed. What's going on? It's over, Timothy, Linda said flatly, staring ahead as if the words carried no weight. John has it all. He's filing lawsuits, and the company won't cover for us. Her tone was calm, but inside, humiliation and bitterness boiled over. John had exposed her, ripped apart her carefully constructed life, and left her with nothing. By the time she ended the call, her phone was flooded with more notifications, texts, emails, missed calls, all reminders of the life crumbling around her. As she sat alone in her car, bitterness gave way to a new emotion, rage. Linda clenched her fists, her breath shaky but controlled. John hadn't just ended her career and reputation, he'd humiliated her, taken everything from her. And now, there was only one thought consuming her mind, revenge. In Alex's dimly lit apartment, Linda, Alex, and Timothy huddled around a table, their voices hushed but filled with urgency. The tension in the room was palpable, and the rage in Linda's eyes was unmistakable. She was no longer the composed woman who cared about appearances. This Linda was consumed by vengeance. He's going to pay, Linda hissed, slamming her fist on the table. I want him to suffer the way I have. I want him gone. Alex glanced nervously between her and Timothy. Linda, you're talking crazy. We've already lost everything, our jobs, our reputations. What are you even planning to do? Linda's gaze sharpened, her voice venomous. If you don't have the stomach for it, Alex, step aside. But I won't rest until John pays for ruining my life. Later that night, the confrontation reached its breaking point. John was in his home, unaware of the storm brewing outside, when Linda and her accomplices arrived. The door burst open with a loud crash, and Linda stormed in, a pistol trembling in her hand. Alex and Timothy followed close behind, their faces tense with fear and adrenaline. Did you really think you could destroy my life and walk away unscathed? Linda hissed, her voice trembling with rage. Her wild eyes betrayed the unstable fury driving her actions. John froze, his hands slowly raising in an attempt to de-escalate. Linda, he said calmly, trying to keep his voice steady, you don't have to do this. Think about the boys. Think about yourself. But Linda's grip on the pistol only tightened. The boys, she spat. You think you're the hero here, John? You think this is about them? This is about you tearing my life apart. Before John could respond, two sharp cracks echoed through the room. The first shot struck him in the stomach, and the second grazed his side. He doubled over, collapsing to the floor as the metallic tang of blood filled the air. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, and his vision blurred as pain coursed through his body. Linda, stop! Alex shouted, but Linda was already frozen in place, staring at what she had done. That hesitation was all Carl needed. Bursting through the doorway, he moved swiftly, pulling his weapon from his waistband and firing two shots. One struck Timothy in the leg, sending him to the ground with a scream, while the other shattered a lamp, scattering the room in chaos. Stay with me, John. Carl barked, dropping to his knees beside his brother. He pressed his hands to John's wound, trying to stem the bleeding. You're going to be okay. Just stay awake. Linda, Alex, and Timothy scrambled, the chaos giving them just enough time to flee. The sound of tires screeching outside signaled their escape. Hours later, John lay unconscious in a hospital bed, stabilized but weak from the ordeal. Carl paced the waiting room, his mind racing as police officers pieced together the events. Surveillance footage from the neighborhood and the evidence left behind painted a clear picture. Linda, Alex, and Timothy were now fugitives. When Carl received a call from the private investigator with Linda's location, his expression darkened. She's holed up at 4516, Edgewood Avenue, the PI said. But be careful. They're desperate. Thanks, Carl replied, his voice cold and resolute. Gathering a trusted crew, Carl drove toward the address, the tension in the car thick enough to cut. These were men who understood loyalty and didn't shy away from unfinished business. Carl didn't need to explain the stakes, they all knew. As they pulled up to the house, Carl's jaw clenched. His focus was unwavering, his goal clear. He stepped out of the car, locking eyes with his crew. If Linda thought she could ruin John's life and walk away, Carl said, his voice low and dangerous, she was dead wrong. Linda squirmed against her restraints, her wide eyes brimming with panic as her breath came in ragged gasps. "You can't do this," she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her desperation. Carl leaned in closer, his expression cold and unyielding. His voice, a low growl, cut through the tense silence. "You're out of options, Linda. No one's coming to save you." The room fell deathly silent, the only sound the shallow, uneven breaths of the captives. Carl's men moved methodically, securing the house and ensuring there was no chance of escape. This wasn't about ending things, not yet. It was about making them understand the consequences of their betrayal. Carl's words were laced with quiet menace as he added, "You're going to wish you'd never crossed my family." Under the moonlit sky, the SUVs rolled to a stop in a desolate, dusty clearing. The headlights dimmed, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Carl and his men exited the vehicles with grim determination, dragging Linda, Alex, and Timothy out. The captives struggled futilely, but their resistance only earned them rough shoves to the ground. Forced to kneel in the dirt, Linda, Alex, and Timothy exchanged terrified glances, their wide eyes darting between Carl and his crew. The tension was suffocating, the cold night air thick with fear. Carl stepped forward, his boots crunching on the dry earth with each deliberate step. His gaze was icy, his voice calm yet filled with barely contained fury. "You thought you could destroy my family and walk away," he began, each word sharp as a blade. "You thought there wouldn't be consequences." Without breaking his stride, Carl raised his hand in a signal. One of his men silently stepped forward, handing him a weapon. Carl took it without a word, the glint of the moonlight catching on the blade of the machete. He turned it slowly in his hand, inspecting the edge as though deliberating his next move. When he spoke again, his voice was low and steady, slicing through the silence like a razor. "You know, I gave up this life. The crime, the violence, all of it. I did it for my brother. For his boys. They were my anchor. My reason to be better." Carl crouched down, bringing himself to Linda's level, his face inches from hers. "But people like you," he whispered coldly, "people like you make me question why I even bothered." Linda gasped sharply, frozen in terror as Carl's words hung heavy in the air. Her wide, helpless eyes darted toward Alex and Timothy, their expressions mirroring her fear. The tension was stifling, broken only by the faint rustling of the wind through the surrounding trees. Carl remained still, his face a mask of cold indifference. The blade in his hand caught the faint gleam of moonlight as he shifted his focus. "You were so bold before, Linda," Carl said, his voice dripping with quiet disdain. He turned the blade in his hand and drove it into the ground near Alex, the sharp sound reverberating through the clearing. Everyone flinched at the sudden movement, their fear palpable. Dark stains spread across the dirt as Carl turned his attention to Timothy. Linda's sobs grew louder, her body racked with uncontrollable shudders as she bore witness to the chilling scene. "Please," she cried through her gag, her voice fractured and desperate. "Stop, please." Carl didn't even glance in her direction, his cold focus now fully on Alex. "And you," he said, his voice razor sharp, "thought your wealth and power made you untouchable. That was your mistake. I'll correct it." Alex's trembling lips parted as though to protest, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed by the weight of Carl's towering presence. Carl moved closer to Linda, his boots grinding into the dirt as he loomed over her trembling form. She recoiled as he knelt down, bringing his face inches from hers. His breath was icy, and when he spoke, his words froze the air. "You ruined my brother's life," he whispered, his voice deathly calm. "You betrayed your family, destroyed your reputation, and now, you'll face the consequences." Linda's expression twisted into a mixture of terror and confusion, her body trembling uncontrollably. What are you going to do?" she stammered, barely able to form the words. Carl's lips curled into a faint, menacing smile. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, rising to his full height. "But first, you're going to sit here and think about every decision that brought you to this moment." He turned to his men, nodding toward the vehicles. "Secure them," he ordered. "We're not done yet." The crew moved swiftly, dragging the captives back to the SUVs. Linda's sobs echoed through the clearing, mingling with the faint rustle of the wind. Carl watched silently, his mind cold and focused. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. And Carl would see it through to the end. "I should have started with you," Carl said, his voice low and sharp as a blade. The weight of his words struck Linda like a hammer blow, leaving her paralyzed with fear. A guttural scream tore from her throat, shattering the stillness of the night. Her cry echoed through the clearing, raw and desperate, but Carl didn't flinch. His movements were deliberate, his calm demeanor betraying none of the fury simmering beneath the surface. "You know what we call this place?" Carl asked, his voice slicing through the silence like the very edge of his blade. Linda lifted her head weakly, her face pale and contorted with pain. She couldn't muster a response, her faint, gasping breaths the only sound she could produce. Carl's lips curled into a dark smile, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line surrounding the clearing. "We call it, the spot," he continued. "It's where we leave the scraps, for the scavengers." As if summoned by his words, faint shapes began to emerge at the perimeter of the clearing. Jackals and coyotes slinked out from the shadows, their movements cautious but purposeful. Their glowing eyes reflected the moonlight, adding an eerie atmosphere to the already tense scene. Carl stepped back, his men standing silently behind him, their postures rigid and alert. But he paused, his head tilting slightly, as if considering his next move. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air. Hours later, the hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. John lay in the bed, pale but stable, his body weakened from the ordeal. The door creaked open, and a police officer entered, holding a clipboard. "We've pieced together the events as best we can," the officer said, his tone neutral. "Unless new evidence surfaces, the case will be closed." John nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." The officer left, and John turned his gaze toward Carl, who sat silently by the window. Carl's posture was casual, but his sharp eyes were fixed on the hospital parking lot below, scanning every movement. "Carl," John said softly, his voice steady despite the weakness in his body. "Was it you?" For a long moment, Carl didn't respond. His focus remained on the view outside, the faint glow of the streetlights casting shadows across his face. Finally, with a slight shrug, he turned to face his brother. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes betraying nothing but loyalty. "Does it matter?" Carl asked, his voice calm but tinged with a quiet edge. "You're alive, and that's what counts." John studied his brother's face, searching for answers, but found only a steadfast resolve. He didn't press further. Far from the hospital, in a dimly lit room, Carl sat surrounded by his crew. The air was thick with tension, the weight of recent events settling over them. One of the men stepped forward, holding a sleek black jacket embroidered with a vivid red dragon across the back. Carl took the jacket, a faint smile playing on his lips as he slid it over his shoulders. The fabric felt familiar, the weight of it carrying an air of power and authority. His men watched in silence, their quiet respect evident as Carl adjusted the cuffs and straightened the collar. The dragon on his back burned bright, a symbol of the man he had become and the sacrifices he had made. His sharp eyes swept over the room, his steely resolve unshaken. "Let's get moving," Carl said simply, his voice firm and commanding. The crew obeyed without question, filing out of the room with practiced precision. For John, the future stretched before him as a path of hope, a chance to rebuild the life that had nearly been torn from him. He thought of his boys, their laughter, their bright smiles, and clung to the promise of better days ahead. For Carl, the road was far darker, a path of reckoning that he walked willingly to protect the family he loved. He carried the burden of his choices in silence, knowing the price of his actions but never regretting them. As the brothers forged their separate journeys, one in the light and the other in the shadows, they remained bound by a singular truth: family was everything. And for both of them, this truth would guide their steps, no matter the cost.